Hi, I'm Dr. Christine Hanlon from the University of Central Florida, here to talk to you about the SEER hierarchy of active listening. This hierarchy of active listening is based on a triangle kind of symbolic concept. It was developed in 1983, so it's been around for a really long time, and it's been taught a lot of different ways. And some of the ways, some concepts have gone kind of on the wayside, so I want to talk about that a little bit. And there's some kind of misunderstandings about it as well. So first of all, let's talk about it. Let's draw our triangle so we can focus on the different types in terms of our stages of listening. The very first stage, the foundational part of our triangle here, is the sensing stage. Sensing. So when we sense a message, we use our 5 senses. And a lot of times people think, well, where does that come from, number one, and number two, how do we exactly do that? So first of all, when we talk about sensing the message and using our 5 senses, that comes way back into the 1930s, 1940s, when we first started talking about the communication model. One of the important things that they said should be a component of the model was the fact that we use our 5 senses. And the concept of the channel initially in the earlier communication models was the 5 senses. So what are our 5 senses? So number one, we've got hearing, which is about sound, right? Makes sense. Hearing is foundational. You have to hear in order to listen. And as you read in the chapter, hearing is the foundational part of listening. But listening is different. Listening is what we do with that stimuli, how we process that cognitively in our brains. Hearing is just the stimuli hitting our eardrums, not being processed by the brain like you do with listening. So hearing, an important part of sensing the message. Other types of senses, we have sight, of course, very important when we're looking at nonverbals, right? So the idea that we look at the message and we think about the message in that way using sight makes a whole lot of sense. Another of our 5 senses is touch. Certainly that has a huge importance with nonverbal communication and how we touch each other. We often create hierarchy through touch as well, so touch being a very important sense. And then we've got 2 kind of types of senses that really don't match, right? So when we think about smell and we think about taste, we think, how do you taste the message? How do you smell the message? Clearly those are used on a lesser extent when we're talking about communication. Now, you could argue there are situations when you do that, though. And so those are important in terms of our senses. But sensing is the foundational part of listening. It's the first step. It's the first stage of listening. So very important to think about that. The next stage of listening in the hierarchy is interpreting. And when we're interpreting the message, we're doing so based on our own personal set of values, our own experiences, our own frame of references. And so we got to think about, what experiences, what cultural identities do we have that are going to change the way that we interpret a message. And so we always want to think about who we are and how we're taking in that message. We may interpret messages very differently based on our experiences that we've had. So this often is a very problematic step in terms of the communication process. The next step for the SEER hierarchy of listening is evaluating. And evaluating is when you start to make judgments, or when you do make judgments. So when you're evaluating a message, you're thinking about, am I going to accept the message? Am I going to reject the message? What am I going to do with this? And so you're processing it in a way where you're making judgments. You're evaluating that particular message. The next step is responding. Let me make sure I get a different color here. Here we go. And when you're responding to a message, that doesn't necessarily mean verbal. That could just be nonverbal. When we think about responding, when we think about the gender of the person who is receiving the message, oftentimes a lot of gender research looks at feminine versus masculine speech communities, and of course that's on a huge continuum. But when we do look at feminine speech communities, we often see that people from feminine speech communities are far more responsive when they're receiving a message, when they're listening. And so they'll do things like they'll nod and they'll say yes, mm-hmm, mm-hmm, uh-huh, right? And they'll do things that affirm the message in a lot of different ways. At least that's the way that some people interpret that. When you talk to people from feminine speech communities, though, often when we talk about responding, and we acknowledge that we nod when we are listening to someone, that is what that means to most of us, that we are listening and we understand. What often happens and creates misinterpretations in this process is when the other person is from a masculine speech community and they interpret that response to mean agreement. Just because someone is nodding doesn't necessarily mean they agree. It could just be that, yes, I understand. I acknowledge that you're saying this information. So we got to be very careful about when we're thinking about the responding stage. So if you are from a feminine speech community, understanding that some people from masculine speech communities may interpret your nod as agreement. And people from masculine speech communities may want to think about maybe that nod doesn't mean yes and that I agree. It just means I understand. And that's different for everyone. And it depends where you are on the continuum and how you're using your communication at that moment in time. There are lots of other variables that go into play there. Let's see, what color haven't I used? Yellow. So the top of the hierarchy is remembering. And this is the part that often people don't talk about, they don't agree with. And when we're talking about the SEER method, you notice it's SIERR. SIERR. It's the SEER hierarchy of active listening. There are two R's here. Very important, that second R, because that second R is remembering. And remembering, if you don't remember the message, why are you listening? You should be going through all of these stages as you're listening and processing a message. If you're not remembering it, what good is it listening in the first place? So remembering is a really important part. The ironic part about the SEER hierarchy of listening is that when you hear people talk about it, oftentimes they don't talk about that second R. They just talk about the SEER, SIER, and they forget about the remembering, which is the highest part and probably the most important. If you're not remembering, what's the point, right? So remembering is an important stage. Because people often forget that stage, we've had some people say, well, maybe we should change this SEER model, and rather than say remembering, instead say memory. So sometimes when you hear people talk about the SEER method of active listening, you'll hear them actually say SEERM. So listen to how they say it. And that way, it reminds people not to forget the second R, which is so important. So SEER hierarchy of listening, this is how we actively listen to one another. It's the stages that we should be going through as we're listening. It's really breaking down and analyzing the listening process. And hopefully this will help you not only get an A on the test, but also be a more effective listener in your personal and professional lives.